Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to my session about Docker for SQL Server developers. Over the next 60 minutes, I want to show you how you can use Docker in combination with SQL Server, and I want to show you here some interesting ways how to interact with SQL Server, and I will also give you here a little preview about SQL Server 2022, the new version, which was just released as a CTP version a few days or weeks ago. A few words about my person. My name is Klaus Aschenbrenner. I'm based in Vienna, in Austria, and I provide with my company SQL Passion, SQL Server consultancy and training services across Europe. Prior to COVID-19, I was traveling around the world, talking and speaking about SQL Server. Yeah, and these days I'm mostly doing all those things online, like today to you. I'm also a Microsoft Certified Master for SQL Server, which is the highest technical certification that you can achieve on SQL Server. I have also written the book Pro SQL Server 2008 Service Broker, which was published by APRS in the summer of 2008, so already a very, very long time ago. And Service Broker was introduced first with SQL Server 2005, and with Service Broker, you can write message-based asynchronous database applications. If you want to find more out about my person, about the services I'm offering, you can visit my website at sqlpassion.at, where I'm also providing a lot of other content, free content around SQL Server. I'm blogging about SQL Server. I have a YouTube channel called My SQL Server Quickies, where I'm giving you with short videos some introduction to specialized SQL Server topics. The agenda for today is quite easy. I want to talk about Docker and Docker and Docker. So quite simple. So let's start in the first step by talking about what Docker is about. Docker is more or less a new virtualization technology which evolved from the Linux operating system. And when we talk about virtualization, in the first step, we have to talk about how we have done virtualization in the old way. What is the old way? The old way is the way how we have done virtualization with virtual machines. Every one of you knows virtual machines. Doesn't matter which hypervisor you are using. Maybe you are using VMware FileSphere, maybe you are using VMware Fusion on a Mac system, or even Hyper-V on Windows systems. The idea about a virtual machine, as the name already says, is that you are virtualizing your whole OS installation. So you have a full-blown OS installation. This can be Windows, this can be Linux, doesn't really matter. And when you have created that virtual machine, you are just assigning some resources to that virtual machine. Those resources are, of course, CPU, memory, and storage. And you are doing this for each virtual machine. The problem is now that you are working here with a full-blown OS installation, means you have to license that OS, especially in the context of Windows, and you also have to patch everything. Imagine when Microsoft bringing out new patches every month, I have to upgrade, I have to install those patches on each virtual machine that I have. So when you just have a few virtual machines, this is not really a problem, but when you have a lot of virtual machines, all those processes are very time consuming. Imagine now, as I've said a few days or weeks ago, I don't have a concrete time in my head, Microsoft released the first CTP version of SQL Server 2022. Imagine now you want to test drive that new SQL Server version in an isolated environment. In that case, you have to install a whole new virtual machine, means you have to install Windows on that virtual machine. You have to apply all the patches for Windows. Then you have to download the ISO image for the CTP version of SQL Server, and you have to install that CTP version. So as you already see from that description, this is a long time consuming process until you can connect to your installed CTP version of SQL Server. Later, in my first demonstration, I will show you how we can do the same process with Docker just in the matter of a few seconds. Just imagine you're spinning up a new SQL Server instance just within a few seconds. Also in an isolated environment means when you have problems with that new SQL Server version, you just throw it away and you haven't changed anything on your host system. This is very, very important. The same applies also to virtual machines. When you have problems with that virtual machine, you stop that virtual machine, and afterwards you just destroy, you remove it. And the same also applies to Docker. So how does this work now with Docker? In Docker, we have so-called containers. And inside a container, you are virtualizing one specialized application. It doesn't really matter what application this is. This can be a web server. This can be SQL Server, like in our case. This can be a completely different software, different application that you have implemented, that you have programmed. But the idea is that you are only virtualizing that specific application. Means you are not virtualizing the whole operating system anymore. When you think back about the virtualization in the old way, we had our hypervisor, and on top of that hypervisor, we have virtualized for every virtual machine the guest operating system. And now with Docker, we have our host operating system. Docker works on almost every modern operating system. So Docker works on Windows, Docker works on Linux, Docker works on Mac OS, Docker even works on a Raspberry Pi. And inside the Docker container that you create, you have afterwards your running application, which is virtualized. Means that virtualized application doesn't change anything on your host operating system. Means when you don't need that virtualized application anymore, you just stop that Docker container, and then again you can just throw it away, and you haven't done any changes to your host operating systems. Means this is much better because it's a lightweight virtualization. It's just easier to deploy, and of course you're just dealing with one host operating system. Means you only have to patch and license that host operating system just once. Like in my case today, I'm working here on a Windows system, and I have just to patch that Windows system just once, because I'm only virtualizing one specialized application. In my case, in our case, it's of course SQL Server. Docker is just one well-known container runtime. There are also other runtimes. So Docker just provides you a container runtime and isolates all those containers from each other. So you can think that the Docker container is something like a virtual machine, or let's call it a virtual application. Docker uses here concepts from the Linux kernel, or which have evolved from the Linux kernel. More or less, we are talking here about three different things called kernel namespaces, control groups, and the so-called union file system. Today, I'm just giving you here an introduction to Docker, so I don't want to talk too much about those specialized technologies on which Docker is based on. And as I've already said, Docker just works on every modern OS. Means you can run your Docker containers on Mac, on Linux, on Windows, on Raspberry Pi, and it doesn't really matter. Of course, the processor architecture must match. As we know, for example, I'm doing a lot of Mac. I'm mostly a Mac guy, but these days I'm also doing a lot of Windows again. As you know, Mac has moved from Intel to their own ARM processors called M1, M2, which was just released a few days ago. And of course, when you deploy an application in Docker like SQL Server, which is based on the Intel x64 instruction set, you also have to have a guest or a host OS which is running on that processor architecture. So for example, when you have a Mac M1 or M2 MacBook, you are not able to run SQL Server on that. This is very, very important. Okay, so the host processor architecture has to match with the application that you run inside the Docker container. These days, I'm still having an Intel-based MacBook, means the demos that I'm showing you today, I have prepared them on my MacBook, and I just can use those demos out of the box on my Windows system. It doesn't really matter, because you can virtualize that Docker container on every possible OS on which Docker is running on. So let's talk a little bit about the Docker architecture. First of all, when we look here, we have the client. The client interacts with a Docker host, and first of all, you have to run Docker itself. Means on the Docker host, you have a so-called Docker daemon, which is just a background service. And with that background service, you can interact, for example, with the command line. First of all, you have to pull a so-called image. Those Docker images are stored in a so-called Docker registry. So even Microsoft provides us a Docker container registry. Means when Microsoft publishes a new SQL Server version, for example, a new CU update, Microsoft publishes to their registry, and then we can pull that image through our client to our host. That Docker image, you can think about it like an ISO image. So when you have downloaded SQL Server in the past, you have gone to the MSDN subscription website and you have downloaded the ISO image of SQL Server. In the context of Docker, this is the Docker pull command. You're just pulling a Docker image from a Docker registry to your local workstation. That Docker image is stored on your local workstation, and then you can instantiate that Docker image. Means you use the Docker run command, and then you instantiate the Docker image, and the output is a running Docker container. Means the Docker run command is something like installing SQL Server. Means you are taking that ISO image, you're running setup.exe, you're doing next, finish, and then you have an installed SQL Server instance. And the same thing is doing the Docker run command. You are specifying the Docker image, you are specifying a few parameters like the SA password, as we see later. You have to accept the Euler, and afterwards, after a few seconds, you have a running Docker container, and inside that running Docker container, you have your well-known SQL Server in an isolated environment. Means you're not changing anything on your host environment. This is very, very important. Means when you just have to deinstall that CTP version, you're just stopping that Docker container and you just throw it away. Just think back to the old days when we have installed CTP versions of SQL Server. I have never ever installed CTP versions of SQL Server directly on my workstation, because as we knew, Deinstalling CTP versions of SQL Server was not always supported. Maybe an upgrade or something depending on the version of the CTP. So this was very challenging, and therefore I have always installed CTP versions in virtual machines. But as I've already said, installing a whole new virtual machine just for a CTP version of SQL Server, this was not really convenient because it took a lot of time. And now these days, you're just pulling that specialized Docker image from Microsoft, and you're just instantiating that Docker image with a Docker run command, and the output is a Docker container, which just contains our up and running SQL Server. So a very, very efficient and also a very, very lightweight approach. As I've already said, in the background, you have your Docker engine, which is just a background process, a daemon process, and that background process can be reached through the command line interface, as we will do it today. And you have also some other APIs available, like a REST API, so you can also do all those things programmatically. And the most important thing here are just those images and the containers. As I've said previously, just think about a Docker image as an ISO image of some software that you want to install, and the Docker container is finally the installed, the instantiated image. And inside the Docker container, you have one application up and running. And in our case, this is just SQL Server. Let's talk a few words about some common Docker CLI commands. We will see most of them just in a few minutes. With the Docker pull command, you can just load a new image from a registry. You have registries from every vendor that you know. So Docker itself has a registry, Microsoft has a registry. When you think about other vendors in the cloud space like Amazon, VMware, and so on, they also providing their own registries for their own Docker images. So there's a lot of things to explore. Then you have the Docker run command, which just instantiates a new container from an image. Means in that case, when we do the Docker run command on a SQL Server image, SQL Server just starts up and listens on a specific TCP IP port on your host machine. When you don't need that Docker container anymore, you can do a Docker stop command, means you're just stopping that Docker container. It's the same thing as when you are stopping SQL Server through SQL Server Configuration Manager. It's just in a stopped state. It's not reachable anymore, of course. When you need it again, you do a Docker start command, means you're starting up SQL Server inside that Docker container again, and it's again reachable. And of course, when you're stopping and starting a Docker container, you're not losing any data. This is also very important. Imagine we're talking today about databases in a Docker container. So when you have an up and running Docker container, of course, you are generating some data that you are storing in your SQL Server databases. Means when you are stopping that Docker container, you're not losing that data. Means when you're starting up that Docker container later, you have the same state of your database. So this is also very important. You are only losing the data in the Docker container when you are completely removing the Docker container. So this is also very, very important. When we have later some more time, I will also talk maybe about Docker volumes. And with Docker volumes, you will not lose data when you're also removing Docker containers. And these Docker volumes provides you nice ways to migrate SQL Server databases, for example, from one Docker image version to another Docker image version. So if we have time, I will also show you here a specific example. With the Docker copy command, you can copy a locally stored file into a Docker container. Imagine you have an up and running SQL Server Docker container and you want to restore a database backup. You have to have that database backup inside the Docker container. So you can copy that locally stored backup from your host environment with the docker cp command into the Docker container. With the docker exec command, you can start an interactive shell. You can even create your own Docker images. Means when you have made some changes to a Docker image, you can use the docker commit command, creating your own Docker image. And finally, you can even push those images that you have created to your own registry. So for example, I even have some specialized Docker images of SQL Server stored in my own Docker registry on the Docker Hub. So there are quite interesting things that you can do with Docker. SQL Server works since SQL Server 2017 on Docker. So with SQL Server 2017, Microsoft first introduced Docker support. SQL Server 2017 was also the first release of SQL Server, which was also available with Linux. And this is also very, very important. When you are running SQL Server inside a Docker container, you're not running the Windows-based SQL Server anymore. No, you are running the Linux-based SQL Server. And Microsoft is using here internally Linux Ubuntu 20.04. A lot of people are thinking, oh my God, Microsoft has ported here the Windows-based SQL Server to Linux, means it will contain a lot of bugs. No, that's not the case. Microsoft has not ported SQL Server to Linux. When you are running SQL Server on Linux, or when you are running SQL Server inside a Docker container, you are running the same Windows-based SQL Server on Linux. Just think about it. So Microsoft has just abstracted in some ways the Windows OS, means when SQL Server calls into the Windows OS, Microsoft just intercepts that Win32 API calls and forwards those Win32 API calls to the corresponding system calls inside Linux. Means when you are running SQL Server on Linux, you're running the same SQL Server as when you're running SQL Server on Windows. Those are the same versions, byte by byte, bit by bit. Means when you have one bug in the Windows-based SQL Server, you will also encounter the same bug on the Linux-based SQL Server or in a Docker container, because it's the same bits and bytes that you're running. So this is very, very important. Microsoft has not ported SQL Server to Linux. They have just abstracted the OS in some clever way so that SQL Server can also work on other operating systems like Linux or even Mac. Okay, let's switch now away from PowerPoint, and I want to show you now how we can work with SQL Server in a Docker container. I have here Azure Data Studio. I'm here on a Windows system, means I have here a larger system. So as you can see, I'm using here an AMD system with 24 cores. I have here 128 gigabytes of RAM available and some storage. And now imagine we want to test drive the new CTP version of SQL Server 2022. Interesting enough, today is the first time that I have said SQL Server 2022 out to an audience. It's the first time that I have heard from my voice that words SQL Server 2022. First of all, when you want to work with SQL Server 2022, we have to pull that specific Docker image from the Microsoft Container Registry. Means you're doing the Docker pull command and you're just specifying that image version. Means the Microsoft Container Registry is accessible through mcr.microsoft.com/mssql/SQL Server :2022-latest. So with that command, we are pulling the latest version of the SQL Server 2022 image from the Microsoft Container Registry. So let's do that. As you see, I have already done that because otherwise it would take a few minutes. And my image that I have from SQL Server 2022 is up to date. So that image is already there. Let's have a look on that image. We have a Docker image command, ls list, and that command just lists you all the images that you have stored locally on your system. So as you see, I have here that 2022 latest image of SQL Server. I have here images of SQL Server 2019, which is the latest CU update. We will see that later. And I have also here the RTM version of SQL Server 2019. And I have also other images. As you can see, I have here my own images. Some months ago, I have worked with Service Broker, means I have created here my own images for initiator services and target services. Interesting enough, I have here another image called Chaos Build Environment. I'm a crazy person. I've talked about that with Gianluca prior to my talk. I'm just having crazy hobbies, and one of my hobbies is I'm also implementing my own operating system. Just think about it. I'm writing my own x64 based operating system, and to build that operating system, you need a lot of different specialized compilers, assemblers, and so on. And I have wrapped all that build infrastructure into my own Docker image. Means when I want to build my OS, I'm just spinning up a container of that image, and inside that container, I can build that OS in an isolated environment. Means when I'm moving to a new or another system, I just have to pull that image from the container registry, and within a few minutes I have my whole built environment available, regardless which OS I'm using. As I've said, these days I'm switching a lot between Windows and Mac systems. Okay, so we have our latest SQL Server 2022 image locally stored. As you can see, those images are not that large. More or less 2 gigabytes. When you think about an ISO image that you download from MSDN, they are quite larger. And this is now more or less the ISO image. Means when you have pulled that Docker image, you have no running Docker container. So let's instantiate now a Docker container. And for that, we can use the Docker run command. Means the Docker run command takes a Docker image. So I'm specifying here the 2022 latest CTP image. I'm giving that Docker container a name, like SQL 2022, and then you specify a port mapping. As we all know, SQL Server listens on port 1433, and I'm just binding that port from the Docker container to the local port 1433 of my Windows system. Means when I'm spinning up, when I'm starting that Docker container, I can reach that Docker container through the port 1433 of my Windows machine. This is very, very important. And then we also have to specify some environment variables. As we know all, we need an SA password. So I'm using here a very strong SA password. No, just kidding. This is not very strong. And of course, you also have to accept the Euler. Otherwise, SQL Server would not start. Think about it. When you're installing SQL Server in the old traditional way through setup.exe, you're doing the same. You're accepting the Euler, otherwise you can't continue. And of course, you also have to specify the SA password. And we're doing that here through the command line. So let's run that command. Let's go to the command line. And we are running SQL Server. Just think about it. This was maybe a second, and within a second, we have started up SQL Server 2022 in a Docker container. Just think about it. Imagine how we could test drive SQL Server 2022 in the old way, in an isolated environment. You have to install a whole Windows OS inside a VM, or maybe a Linux OS inside the VM, and then you have to install SQL Server. It takes you at least an hour, maybe more. And here we are just doing everything in a matter of a second. Just think about it. We can use now the docker bs-a command. That command shows us all the running processes. And as you can see, we have here now a Docker container, which is up for 59 seconds. We see the board mapping means the application which is running inside that container is now accessible through the board 1433 on my local Windows machine. So when I connect to localhost on board 1433, I'm accessing SQL Server inside that Docker container. Just try it. I have here localhost. We have here the server name. With the server name, username SA, we use our strong password. We click connect, and guess what? We have connected to SQL Server 2022. As you see, we have our system databases and we have no other application database. Let's do here, select add that version. Again, I have to connect. For that script, we're doing the same thing here again. And we have here SQL Server 2022 CTP 2.0, and it's a developer edition, and we are running on Linux Ubuntu 20.04. Just think about it. These days, when I'm working with SQL Server, while I'm not doing productive work with SQL Server, more or less, I'm doing research, I'm testing different things for customers. I'm not installing SQL Server in the classical old way anymore. No, I'm just working with Docker containers because it's just easier. It's just easier for me. I'm not crazy, I'm not stupid by creating a new virtual machine and then I'm installing SQL Server in that virtual machine. No, I'm just spinning up a Docker container and that's it. And when I don't need that Docker container anymore, I'm just throwing it away, and I haven't changed my host operating system in any way anymore, because we are just virtualizing with Docker one specialized application. And in our case, that application is just SQL Server. So we have here a vanilla install of SQL Server. As we have said, as we have seen, we have no user-defined databases there. So the question is now, how can we restore in that Docker container a database? As I've said previously, when you install or when you want to restore a database, that database must be in the file system inside the Docker container. You can't access the file system in a direct way of your host system. So first of all, we have to copy a database backup from my Windows machine to the Docker container. And we are using here the docker cp command, docker cp command, docker copy command. As you see, in my file system, when we do an here, I have here an AdventureWorks database. I have made that backup years ago on a Windows system. Maybe it was really in the year 2014, 2015. I don't really know it anymore, but this is a quite old backup of the AdventureWorks database. Most of my demonstrations are based on the AdventureWorks database. A lot of people are thinking that I'm crazy, but for me it works. So this is a very, very old AdventureWorks backup. Let's copy that backup. Whoops. Let's copy that backup into our Docker container. So we use the docker cp command. We specify the local file, and then we specify the destination. We specify the name of our Docker container, SQL 2022, and then we just specify the folder where we want to put that backup. Of course, as you see here, everything is here Linux based. As you know, Linux has no drives. In Linux, you have so-called mount points. And here I'm just copying that backup into the folder far backups. Let's verify that. What we are doing for verifying that is that we are starting an interactive command line session against our Docker container. So we execute in an interactive way in our SQL 2022 container the bash command. Bash is a command line on a Linux system. As you see, our command line has changed, and we are now with the command line inside our Docker container. So when I'm doing here an ls command, I'm seeing the content of the Docker container. So I'm not with the command line on my Windows system anymore. No, I'm inside the Docker container. So let's go to the far backups folder, do an ls again, and hey, cool, we have here our AdventureWorks database. And it was done in the year 2017. Almost 5 years ago. Almost 4.5 years ago. And with exit, we are back on our Windows system. Let's try to restore that backup. Let's have a look into that backup. I'm doing here a restore file list only from disk. I'm specifying the backup. And as you can see, this is a backup that I have done years ago on a Windows system. As you can see, back in these days, my SQL Server files were placed on a G drive, on Windows, of course. So we are taking here a Windows-based SQL Server backup, and we are trying to restore that Windows-based SQL Server backup in a Docker container, which is based on Linux. Means when we now restore our AdventureWorks database, we also have to move our data and transaction log files. And I'm just moving the data and transaction log files to the folder far opt ms SQL data, which is the default folder where Microsoft stores data and transaction log files on a Linux system. Let's do that. We run that. Takes a few seconds, and as you can see now, SQL Server takes now that backup and just upgrades our database from a very old version 782 to the current version of 950. SQL Server on Linux or in a Docker container is doing the same thing as when you would restore that backup on a Windows-based system. It's just the same thing. So when we do a refresh here, we have our AdventureWorks database. We can even create other databases. Let's create here a food database. It's just there. Inside the Docker container. We haven't changed my Windows host operating system in any way. Everything that we have done so far is inside that Docker container. And now when we don't need that Docker container anymore, we just stop it. So when we do a docker bsa command again, we see the container was exited 4 seconds ago. The container is stopped and therefore SQL Server is stopped. Means when we want now to access SQL Server, you will get a timeout because nobody listens on port 1433. Let's start SQL Server again, or the Docker container. Let's start SQL Server 2022. And again, it's up. Means when we reconnect here, it's up. And very, very important, when we do here a refresh, we haven't lost any data. Our databases are still there. This is very, very important when you're stopping and when you're stopping and starting a Docker container, you're not losing any data. You see, you have still the AdventureWorks database, and we also have the foo database that we have manually created with the create database command. So this is very, very important. You're not losing any data. You only lose the data when we do a docker stop command and afterwards a docker remove command. So we are just removing the Docker container. It's the same when you're throwing away a virtual machine. It's just gone. Everything is gone. Means we are again in a clean state. We have the same state on the host operating system, in my case Windows, as previously. But we have test-driven SQL Server 2022 in an isolated environment. Just think about it. Without the overhead of a full-blown virtual machine installation. And that's the great thing. We have just done it in an isolated environment. And it doesn't matter if you're running those commands on a Windows system, if you're doing the same thing on Linux, if you're doing the same thing on a Mac system, it just works. I can take my MacBook and I'm just running the same commands with the same outcome. This is very, very important. For Docker, it's completely transparent on which OS you're running it. The only important thing is that the processor architecture must match. So on a new M1 or M2 MacBook, you can't run our traditional SQL Server. Only SQL Server Edge, which is a very lightweight, specialized version of SQL Server. That one would work, but our traditional x64-based, Intel-based SQL Server would not run on an Apple M1 or M2 device. Cool. Are there any questions so far, Gianluca?
No questions so far.
Perfect. So let's try to go back to PowerPoint. So as we have seen, working with SQL Server in a Docker container is very, very easy. And for me, it's just the preferred way these days to work with SQL Server. I don't know when I have installed SQL Server the last time in a traditional virtual machine. This is just too much work for me. More or less, I'm just working with Docker containers because this is a lightweight installation. And when I don't need that Docker container anymore, I just remove it. The problem with removing a Docker container is the fact that you're removing everything. You're removing the SQL Server installation inside that Docker container and also all the databases. Means when we have removed our Docker container, we have lost our AdventureWorks database, we have lost the foo database that we have created. So the question is, what is when you want to preserve those databases? Imagine you want to remove a Docker container, but you don't want to lose the databases. Means how do you deal with persistent data in a Docker container? The easiest way is you just do a backup and restore of your databases. That's quite simple. Means before you are removing the Docker container, you are doing a backup of your database, then you copy that backup with the docker cp command from the container into your host operating system, and then you're just removing the container. Quite simple. Or the better way, you're working with Docker volumes. This is quite interesting. Docker volumes are just separate Docker objects, and when you run a Docker image, or when you're instantiating a Docker image, you're just mapping a specific folder, a specific path inside your Docker container to a Docker volume. Means the content of that folder is stored outside of the Docker container, inside that Docker volume. Means as soon as you're removing the Docker container, you're not losing the content of the Docker volume, because it's just a separate Docker object. And this gives you amazing possibilities with SQL Server on Docker, because you can migrate your SQL Server databases from one SQL Server version to another SQL Server version. And SQL Server supports here migrations from an older version to a newer version of SQL Server, but you can also do a migration from a newer SQL Server version to an older SQL Server version. Let's have a look on that one. Let's go back to our SQL Server. Let's try it. So where we have our Azure Data Studio. Here we are. No, I can't switch. Doesn't matter. Let's open that file. Somehow Azure Data Studio, no. Here we are. No idea. It seems that Azure Data Studio somehow hangs.
Meanwhile, if you want, two questions arrived.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so the first one is how would we handle logs in SQL Docker container instance? Because we would sometimes get error like SQL Server log file is too big in old ways.
You can access those log files through the file system. Or for example, I'm here in a Windows system. Let's go to Docker Desktop. We have here somewhere our no, I will show you that later. I've currently no container up and running because we have removed it. But when you have an up and running container, you can even access the SQL Server log file through the Docker Desktop application. I will show you that in a few minutes.
Okay, the second question is, I think that in case of performance issues, they must be faced with underlying Ubuntu OS. Is that correct?
Depends. SQL Server mainly is dependent on storage subsystem and everything, so you have to carefully check everything. But SQL Server on Linux is not slower as SQL Server on Windows. Maybe it's even faster because Linux is more lightweight compared to a Windows OS installation.
Okay, that was it. Thanks.
Perfect. Cool. So let's create now a new Docker volume. So we say here Docker volume create, and the name of that volume is SQL volume. We can have a look on that volume with the docker volume ls command, and it's there. Means when we now spin up a new Docker container, we do again the docker run command with all the parameters that we have seen so far, and I'm specifying now the RTM version of SQL Server 2019. So I'm not doing here a SQL Server 2019 or 2022-latest. No, I'm just specifying the SQL Server 2019 RTM version. The name of that Docker container is also SQL Server 2019 _RTM. And now with the -v command, we specify that we want to map the content. Make this a little bit larger. We want to map the content of the folder file opt MS SQL inside the Docker container to the SQL volume that we have created previously. So the content of that folder is not stored in the Docker container anymore. No, it's stored in that volume that we have created. Let's do that. Our Docker container is again up and running. So let's go back to the Docker desktop. We have here now our Docker container, and somehow, yeah, when you click here, you have access to the SQL Server log. The traditional SQL Server log that you know from SQL Server Management Studio. So you see here everything. I have used that already very, very often when SQL Server not started up, but I had here some problems from my side. So this is for me the preferred way to access the SQL Server log, or you're just accessing the SQL Server log through an interactive comment session through the file system. That's the other way. So we have now an up and running SQL Server 2019 RTM version. We have the same board mapping as previously. So when we do a reconnect here, let's do a select at that version. We see now we have now SQL Server 2019 RTM version. And again, it's a new Docker container, means we don't have any databases there. Let's restore again our AdventureWorks database. So we again copy that backup file into the Docker container. Now we are copying it into SQL Server 2019 RTM, and we are just doing the same restore operation as previously. We also create another database, so we have the same state as previously, but now our Docker container is just based on the SQL Server 2019 RTM version. And now imagine the following. We are now stopping that Docker container. It's stopped. Again, we can verify that with the docker PSA command. It was a little bit too much S's. Docker PSA command, it's in the exited status. And now the databases that we have created are part of the volume. So the volume that we see here, the SQL volume, just contains all the databases of that SQL Server instance. And what we are doing now in the next step is the following. We run a new Docker container. I'm running here now the latest version of SQL Server 2019. The latest version of SQL Server 2019. It's a completely new Docker container, and I'm specifying the same SQL volume. Means when SQL Server starts up, SQL Server sees, hey, I have here already databases, and SQL Server just migrates those databases from the SQL Server 2019 RTM version to the latest version of SQL Server 2019. So we are just migrating those databases to the latest version of SQL Server 2019 when we run now that Docker container. Let's do that. Of course, in the meantime, we can't connect because SQL Server is in the upgrade mode. As you can see here, I was able to catch that error message. So login failed for user SA. Reason SQL Server is in script upgrade mode. Only administrators can connect at this time. Just think about it. We are upgrading the RTM version-based databases from SQL Server 2019 to the latest version of SQL Server 2019 through the use of Docker volumes. And as you see, the latest version of SQL Server 2019 is CU15. And we have not lost any database. We still have access to our AdventureWorks database and to the food database that I have created previously. Just think about it. We have done an in-place upgrade of those databases. We just moved them from SQL Server 2019 RTM version to the CU15 update. Works out of the box. Let's stop that Docker container. Let's do a Docker stop SQL 2019 latest. PSA. We have both containers in the stopped state. And now let's do the following. Let's start up with the Docker start command. 2019 RTM. We're just starting up the older version of SQL Server. Means in that case, SQL Server is doing during the startup now a downgrade of our databases. It's doing a downgrade, means SQL Server takes the databases from the CU15 version and downgrades it to the RTM version of SQL Server 2019. So previously we have upgraded our databases and now we are just downgrading it. Let's do that. The container is again up and running. Let's do a select add version. Again, we are still in the upgrade mode. Takes a few seconds. Few more seconds, we are up and running. And again, we have the RTM version of SQL Server 2019. Just think about it. Let's stop that container again. Let's stop SQL Server 2019 RTM. And what we are doing now is the following. Let's go back where we had SQL Server 2022. Where we had that. We take that Docker run command. That one will work, hopefully. Specifying here the latest version of SQL Server 2022. Of course, we need here a different name for the Docker container. We're just spinning up a new version. With Docker ps-a. Our Docker container is again up and running. Means when we started up the Docker container of SQL Server 2022, SQL Server has taken now the database files and upgraded them from SQL Server 2019 RTM version to the CTP 2.0 version of SQL Server 2022. Think about it. Let's do a select at that version. We are now on SQL Server 2022 CTP 2.0. And when we do a refresh, we still have access to our databases. Just think about it. With Docker volumes, you can do amazing things regarding upgrades and downgrades of databases. In a very seamless way, you can test drive if your databases are just working on a specific SQL Server version. The crazy thing here is, of course, I'm now on SQL Server 2022 CTP 2.0. When you now stop the Docker container and you want attach, or you want to start up an older version of SQL Server, so something with SQL Server 2019, the downgrade is not supported because we have upgraded here to a CTP version, but the downgrade to an older version is not supported. Again, it's just a CTP version of SQL Server. So that's the idea, that's the story of Docker volumes. They are really, really powerful when you want to work in a seamless way with different SQL Server versions, and when you want to try out how your database reacts, how your database works on a specific SQL Server version. Cool. So that was my story about SQL Server for Docker developers. I hope that you have enjoyed my talk. I hope that you have learned hopefully a few new things, and maybe some of you will try Docker in the near future, because in my opinion, Docker is a real game changer, because you don't need full-blown virtual machine installations anymore to test drive, for example, a newly available SQL Server version. Cool. So thanks for attending my session. Enjoy the remaining day of that conference, and hopefully we will see each other again very, very soon in a personal setup again. Thanks and enjoy your day.